So, Diego, we are back again for another episode.
We are back and we have quite a few episodes in the rear mirror right now for season 2. But I'm excited not just about today's topic, but about everything we have lining up because we're expecting to have Tyler Cohen on the podcast soon. We're expecting to have the governor who transformed Madrid into a free market hub, Esperanza Aguirre. We keep talking to opposition leaders in Venezuela. Some of them have been in jail and they are ready to tell their story and they will be joining us very soon. So we're thankful for all the love, for listening to the podcast, and just always grateful to have conversations with you. And like I said, one of our recent episodes, it'd be nice to also have the making of the podcast recorded because we do spend some time bouncing off ideas off of each other. And yeah, happy to talk about Europe.
We're going to be talking about Europe and the European Union.
Isn't it the same?
No,
it's not the same.
I don't think so. I don't think so. And there are two problems, I think, because in conversation, it's just too complicated to be technical all the time. So you say Europe is doing this weird policy, but what they mean is the European Union institution by the Commission is doing a policy. And they, but the European AI, no, there's no European AI, it's the EU AI Act, and it's not actually an act, it's a regulation.
Yeah, everything gets mixed up whenever
Exactly.
you're talking these at first. But to bring it down at first, I think that the push for identity as part of the European project, of the EU project, is one of the reasons why there are so many feelings involved. Because some people have accepted that the EU project involves identity, and others will probably never see it like that. And quite frankly, because I don't think you can force people to feel as if they are part of a political, cultural community, social community of sorts. You can't just force that upon people. That is why many of what the authorities in Brussels have done over the past 2 decades has been essentially wrong, because there is no such thing as European identity in the minds of many individuals. There is a sense of a European community. Of course, there is a historical connection amongst many of these countries, but many of them have been at war with each other through history many times. Others have absolutely no idea about each other's history. I don't think what really connects, say, a Bulgarian to a Portuguese, for example. And just because those ties aren't that strong, the idea of pushing identity into the conversation and even having the flag in every single institutional building across the continent, I think is wrong. So I'm coming off very strong to begin, but I would not advocate for Spain to withdraw. I am not anti-EU per se, but boy, I have so many criticisms. And the fact that we just begin the podcast talking about that like this, I get worked up because I can talk about the EU project, but it should be more limited in its scope, but a lot more effective in its scope. So we have bad governments across Europe, but I don't think the European project is going any better.
Okay, so you start off kind of hot here, Diego.
Very
but
hot.
the European project, what exactly?
Lawyers love it, by the way.
about it?
And you're studying to be a lawyer. So
Yeah, but
put yourself in your pre-lawyer studies. Right?
No, but I always liked the European Union.
Did you?
Yeah, from the Caribbean. The Caribbean always used the EU as a vision of how the Caribbean should be united as well.
Mm-hmm.
The thing called CARICOM, called the Caribbean Community
Yes,
in the
CARICOM.
what the area we call the Caribbean. And it's very loosely modeled off of the EU. And actually the competition law of the CARICOM is kind of based on Article 102 of the EU. So there are some things where we look towards the EU for a long time. So I grew up with that idea. Coming here, I didn't feel it any worse. Now I live in the EU.
You do?
I still think the EU is a very great project
Mm-hmm.
with excesses. There are many, many excesses of the EU. But, I feel oftentimes people put too much pressure on what the EU should do or should not do, where the EU isn't even capable legally of doing all these things.
That is very correct. And I must say that very often we see criticism thrown at Brussels or doing this or doing that in areas in which it doesn't really have to anything to do. It's out of its reach. It's out of its competences. But I will fight you back on this because Brussels does also get its nose on areas where its competences are not there. So Brussels has regularly tried to enter the realms of other areas where it doesn't have any authority. Case in point, tax policy. It should not have revenue powers beyond some income generated by VAT, and the regulation of VAT should be common because products and services can be sold across borders. That was it. Yet we keep on getting new proposals for new tax revenues sources to fund the EU directly when I don't think it's underfunded to begin with. However, if you spend half of your budget in rural subsidies, then we have a problem. So, but
Sure,
it is
but
Brussels stepping out just
the
people.
rural subsidies are determined by the council, which are the ministers of the member states.
Yes.
That's one of the things where it's tricky because I feel the EU is saying, hey, we actually, let's say I'm the EU commissioner. And it might, that doesn't even exist. Suppose I'm the president of the commission.
Yes.
Or the
You're
term-
von der Leyen.
You're
Right?
von der Leyen in this case.
Anything is better than I like you, but it's not hard to be better than von der Leyen.
But let's say I'm von der Leyen and I'm saying, hey, we actually want to do some priorities when it comes to spending, but we are constrained because we are forced to spend 40% of the budget just on agricultural subsidies.
Mhm.
And we can't change that rule. That is a council rule, it's a European council rule too, and Council of Europe rule as well. So we're constrained. So what if we kind of try to find some new avenues to get some money to do budget? Now, I don't particularly agree with that kind of activity, but the incentive is there to do it
Yeah.
because of the constraint by the politicians of the member states,
Mhm.
not sui generis per se of the EU.
That's I can argue with that. That's true. However, that's not a artificial constraint. It is democratic governments from all across the EU that may or may not choose to. So, in a way, what you're telling me is that branch of power wants to overrule what it has been told to manage by another branch of power, and it just so happens that the democratic legitimacy of national governments will always be higher than the indirect choosing of a leader or group of leaders of the commission, which comes off of the European parliamentary election.
That's not what I'm saying per se.
And by the way,
just
who has the cards here?
No, I'm
To,
just saying
to
there's
channel
the-
Trump. The resources are not from national governments. So
No.
if Europe wants to redirect those, it needs to get the national governments in alignment.
No, I'm just saying there is the incentive.
Mhm.
However, you still cannot have EU taxes without national government approval.
Yes, but the fact that Brussels keeps presenting these proposals every single year, we get a new one. Like 2 years ago, corporation tax. This year is the excise taxes. For 2026, apparently there's a proposal about tobacco taxation. But it's old all the time. We get the similar ideas from Brussels. It may be tax A or B or C, but it's always the same thing. Them trying to raise more revenue through taxation. And I have a problem with that. I will fight them all the time whenever they come up with this. And the fact that they keep insisting doesn't make it any nicer to me. It makes it worse.
However, I still think the link still is national because, as you know, the Commission College isn't simply a bureaucratic appointment. It is appointed by the Council and the Parliament, the national leaders
Yes.
that are voted there.
Uh-huh.
So it's not like if the people at the top are just randomly deciding to make new taxes.
You're
the
right.
National
Yes.
governments themselves want the EU to have these kind of
Mhm.
taxes, and they have to vote on them also.
I agree. But when you are given a ball to run with, you may manage that ball as best as you can. I mean, Super Bowl, the Super Bowl is coming up or something, right? You run with it as best as you can, but that's the ball you were given. If you want another ball, just convince me to give you another one. So far, I don't see anyone advocating for agricultural policy reform, which is a mistake.
Yeah.
And that's a mistake by national governments.
That's right.
But I don't see the authorities in Brussels being able to pursue a better outcome of this agricultural policy at this point, because whenever they negotiate trade deals, these barriers remain in place internally, and then a discussion is had externally. Whereas I would advocate that we need to reduce these barriers internally and then also externally. We don't have free markets in agriculture, and that's a problem. And I think the New Zealand example shows that you don't need protectionism to boost your,
But again,
especially coming from Spain, by the
not
way. Which,
primarily an issue of the EU. The EU institutions, the member states themselves can decide to free up their own markets a lot faster.
yeah, but can you? Because you,
To other EU states, yeah.
And
For example, the harmonization problem in the EU is
Mhm.
because national governments decide on how to regulate certain things
Mhm.
because they share different competence with the EU. The national government can decide to be a lot more liberal in their harmonization, and they choose not to be. That's why
That's
the
true.
commission then has to come into place, if it works correctly, and say, hey, Spain, that harmonization attempt is a bit too restrictive. Could we push it a bit further toward liberalization? Granted, the Commission has done a lot less of this in the last 2 years, but it still is the member state that is the driver on the lack of liberalization.
Many of the things that the Brussels has not done in the last few years have been the sort of reforms that have been put forward through the last 2 decades by like-minded people to us. So Brussels has been moving closer to this alignment, but the movement has been, I must say, so slow. Let me give you one clear example. The directives that were introduced to go along with the Green New Deal and the restrictions that were announced for industry, and more specifically the car industry, are crazy. C-R-A-Z-Y, crazy. The fact that you argue that a industrial powerhouse, which is by far the most green large economy in the world, the one that has decoupled the most its output from its emissions, and that has reduced emissions on a per capita and even absolute terms through the last 2 decades the most, that it would just commit economic and jobs market suicide by prohibiting cars that are increasingly sustainable in terms of their emissions. It's crazy. There's no way to understand this. And the fact that this 2035 limit, because in principle, in 9 years' time, cars running on gas were no longer allowed to be produced, manufactured, and sold. However, since then, that has been ruled back. We are still not very clear, but there's been an announcement that this is no longer the case. And I do take the authorities for their word. I wouldn't necessarily do that with the national government. So I do give them more credibility that they're not walking back on this, but the damage is done already. As German, Spanish manufacturers, it's been horrible. And these ideas were not good whenever they were coming from national governments, but the green push by the Brussels policymakers has been horrible, went far beyond what the local authorities in many countries were willing to accept. And the consequences,
countries,
horrible.
But not all countries. Because I always make this point all the time. The EU Commission, you could say the most pure bureaucracy under the college, where they have to get appointed by the actual parliament. It's the most pure bureaucracy. But the Commission cannot approve regulations. Only the parliament, with the Council of the European Union, can approve regulations, both of which are elected officials.
But we're not talking about the Commission. We're talking about the EU. So I have a problem with the whole structure there.
But I'm saying those regulations and things that you're talking about are approved by the people who are elected, right? The Commission, they cannot table a rule, but the Parliament, only Commission can table a new regulation or directive.
That's where I'm going.
But they can't approve it. Only the Parliament and the Council, which are both elected, can approve it. So my point I'm saying is and they are elected by the people.
They are. No, I'm not disputing the legitimacy, huh?
But no, it's not a problem.
They get to table the first draft. They get to start the conversation. The Commission is continuously opening up the debate, and then the whole process begins. The entire opening up has an anchoring effect. It's a first mover advantage. I'm going to have you talk about restricting car manufacturing because I'm concerned with this green obsession that Europeans had 10 years ago and still some do today. Well, you've just influenced the whole debate because you've told me that A, we have to regulate this, B, you've given me a date, and C, you'll probably make it even more stringent as the negotiations go by.
The Parliament and the Council at all times can vote no.
They can.
At all times.
But again, there is an institutional push. I agree, there is a possibility to say no, but...
And they do, like you saw the Mercosur.
But there's other elements I don't like. For example, how do you validate at the Council a vote? Because some areas require unanimity. Some areas require a qualified majority. But the population weight here must be considered very often because, okay, you have a push by 6 states to get something done. And then the council is being lobbied by these 6 states about something they really care about, while others may not really care about. So there's a political process that goes in there. You need to, okay, these folks want this done. We want these other things done. They'll commit, we'll commit. Okay, that sounds good. But the 6 states, their size of their population could be smaller than Madrid, right? Put them all combined. There's micro-states in the EU can be influencing the policy that affects, 300 million people. On the other hand, I also think that should one country want to opt out for a regulation, it should have a lot more leeway to do this or a lot more blocking power. So when the unanimity vote was reversed, in the end, I think it was worse. Although the case was made of, okay, this leads to deadlock, this leads to very difficult negotiations and nothing gets done. Well, a lot has been done since the unanimity vote was no longer the norm for every single vote. And I don't think anyone is more pro-EU now than it was before. In fact, there's more Euroscepticism these days, a lot more.
Okay, I would say unqualified majority voting is a double weight. It's population plus numbers.
Uh-huh.
You still have to have a big chunk of countries that have a large population to approve in the vote.
But you could still have, say, 100 million people being voted against by 200.
So you need
roughly.
You need 65% of population
Yeah,
has to be in the vote.
Yeah, but I'm rounding up. Like, say we have 300 million people living in the EU, roughly, right?
Sure.
So that means that 200 million people can vote for something that 100 million people could vote against, roughly speaking, and this is representative.
Yeah.
So that's quite a lot,
It
if
is
you
a
think
lot.
about it.
Yeah, I guess it depends on policy. Also in the US, you can vote for one party and they're ruled by the entire party,
Mhm.
right? The entire government. That's a similar kind of issue, right? But I do kind of agree that unanimity probably is better. Actually, I think the constraint is good. I don't think that you should have the ability to just create rules easily.
Mhm.
Is the thing. Okay, yes, you might have a good reform or a bad reform, depends on who you are, but it should be hard to bind the entire union on rules. So I do think that unanimity is actually very, very, very strong. I get why people will say, yes, QMV accelerates progress on some areas, but it's too dangerous, as you pointed out.
And there's been this fascination with autocracies and
Yes.
lack of capacity in democracies, of state capacity, of and so on. But I don't think we should fall into that temptation. I think limits of power are part of our strength, not a weakness by any means. And I do want to say that for Spaniards, traditionally speaking, the EU has been a positive force in many areas. There is a very fun example. Google your economic freedom index results right now. Just use the heritage one or the Fraser Institute one, whichever you like the most. Which one do you have a preference?
The Fraser one to me is more sound.
Yeah, it's more complete, right? It includes 80 indicators, but it does come out with 2 years of delay. So it's a bit, for the academics, good. For the journalists and the policymakers,
Sure.
too late maybe. So that's the part I like about the heritage one. But both converge. There is a correlation. I plotted these ones, and it's like 80%
Okay.
concordance of results. So we're essentially talking, roughly speaking, very similar results. When you look at Spain's result in all areas, in those areas where the economic powers are delegated to Brussels or are heavily influenced by Brussels, we score a lot better than in those areas where economic policy is set locally. Since I'm coming over strong against many elements that I don't like, I must say that as a Spaniard, I have to admit that most of our local economic policy debates are even worse than the ones that we have in Europe. Most of the good things happening in Spain are actually less good than they would be if we were just following the EU standards. And just think of the way we've adopted the euro. It's allowed us to leave a weaker currency. The way we've opened up our trade allowed us to leave behind centuries of protectionism that left Spain behind in the Industrial Revolution. And in many other areas like this, there is examples that the EU has been a benefit for change. But then again, there is a push for more. When I'm not sure...
Diego, hold on.
Yes.
This point to me is very important because this is why I think the Brussels view or the Brussels approach to regulation is so bad. It's because they are influenced by national priorities that are garbage.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's not simply the people in Brussels themselves are sui generously have garbage policy ideas. No, they have to respond to their member states. And they have garbage policies.
I was reading a great book, still unpublished, by Rainer Sittelman about, it's called The New Space Capitalism. So he discusses how NASA lost a lot of its technological edge by letting many of its decision-making process be just watered down by Congress. And how each state wanted to have a NASA production facility. Each state wanted to manufacture a little part of the rocket that was going to be sent to space, blah, blah. Now what happens? Then you get a company like SpaceX run by Elon Musk or Blue Origin by Jeff Bezos or many others. And they're just more efficient because they run like a company. Well, in a way, the regulatory policy has been subcontracted to, okay, let's put this proposal forward, but then let states influence the process. That's a problem. And another problem we have is what we call the gold plating thing, which is, okay, Brussels will put forward some legislation. It will be approved by all European level organs. But then when it comes down to the local authorities, they'll just put all the pork barrel they can into the legislation.
Yeah, this is my point again, right? The majority of the bad is because of the increased democratic process.
It could be argued
because the gold plating is the national governments in their pure form nationally doing things without any Brussels overview.
But again, I'm not disputing that, but it's also true that if you have the idea that, okay, these are our leaders, our joint leaders will take us somewhere, this idea of Brussels pushing the agenda forward and beyond what, well, the domestic governments would do, it does create an incentive problem that ultimately brings us to the setting of priorities and the gray line in between setting priorities and just engaging in outright planning. And I think
No, I
with the car
agree. I agree.
car manufacturing is a great example of that. You're setting a goal, energy transition. Why? Why is that a goal? It apparently wasn't that big a goal because 10 years later we're abandoning it.
But it's a goal because the member states want it to be a goal.
Yes, but what I mean is, okay, but they have created a monster that can walk on its own now. So if you tell the monster, I was just watching the Frankenstein movie the other night, Guillermo del Toro, you seen it?
No.
So I did an adaptation on the whole story with Jacob Elordi as the creature.
Random.
Yeah, I didn't even know, but anyway, I'm going off topic. But we'll do one on cinema one day. You get the Frankenstein to walk, then it's got a life on its own. So okay, you set that priority, and just the whole conversation is going to be about that. Europe spent 10 years talking about a priority just because national governments were stupid enough to have one and not just focus on what they should be doing best, which is just growing and fixing their problems. No, setting these big goals opens the door to more ambitious planning, more ambitious goal setting, and that has led to essentially a big mistake. And the green policy suicide is the best example of that.
But these are, again, at the end of the day, I do not think you can claim that in this metaphor that Frankenstein's monster is more powerful than Frankenstein, in this case, the European Union. Because at any point in time, the European governments together can change any policy in the EU institutions because of the power of the council.
Well, once the Frankenstein is strong enough,
No.
even those shackles don't work.
I don't agree. As I said, metaphor breaks down here because the treaties are not lying. The Commission is not all powerful. The Council of Europe is still the European Council. Too many words.
Yes.
The European Council.
Because we have two.
Yes.
The Council of Europe and then the European Council. We're talking about the European Council.
There's the Council of Europe, there's the European Council, and there's the Council of the European Union.
Yes, correct. Yes.
Three different ones. So the European Council is really powerful, setting the agenda, but the Council needs to actually be in control, and they are in control. The problem is European citizens in each member state have bad views about policy.
But I believe the law that you're pointing to, it's correct. That is how power is broken down. I'm not disputing that. But I think you're not fully grasping the effect, the very aggressive push by the EU team in the Commission, most importantly, to get certain things done and get it their way, ultimately influences the whole process more than the spirit of the law would suggest. Case in point, Lisbon Treaty. Votes are done across the EU. 2 countries vote against it. They reject the treaty for the European Union. One was Ireland, I believe. This was ages ago, so forgive me if I'm wrong. And I would say the other one was the Netherlands. I'm wavering on Denmark, but I think it was
Denmark had it.
Denmark or the Netherlands, and I think Ireland definitely was the other one. So they vote against it. What ends up happening? This proposal was rejected. End of the story. Like the Chileans did this a few years ago. There was this big push for constitutional reform, and then there's some votes were done, and they seemed to be advancing. They called a constitutional convention, put forward a document. People rejected it. There was a second go with a different proposal. They was rejected again. No one is talking about constitutional reform. What happened here? The constitutional reform conversation kept happening. The treaty conversation kept happening. Ultimately, the voters were forced to accept this, even though they had not voted for it.
But it was it changed a lot. The initial vote was supposed to be a full-on European constitution. That was the one that got rejected a couple times. Then the Treaty of Lisbon was a watered-down version, which is kind of what you expect. It's a watered-down version of the original plan.
Yeah, but that's like you remember the Chinese had this, how do you call this torture? Yeah, that it feels like that to me. Like we're going to keep on pushing to get these reforms done, to get more power into our hands, and act this big plan.
It's the political class, though, right? If political class does not want these things to happen, they don't happen.
One thing I would say is that one of the bigger problems here is that the European Popular Party has regularly insisted on power sharing the European project with the European Socialist Party, the Social Democrats. That is against all logic to me. And they have done that in the name of consensus. And I don't believe in majorities completely overriding minorities, but I surely do not believe either on a project lacking direction. So the project has not advanced economic freedom in the last 15, 20 years, even half as much as it was doing before it was even formally labeled as the European Union. When we have the European Economic Community, the conversation was a bit more practical.
I have my view on that, but why do you think the economic liberalization has slowed? Now you actually have more institutionalization in the EU.
I believe that all priorities that are set out between a popular party and a social democratic party majorities just lead to these incoherent economic policies that seem to incorporate moderately liberalization programs you could expect from European conservatives. Not very radical, to be honest, but okay, perhaps a bit in the good direction. Let's give it a 6 out of 10. And then you have the social democrats that probably are leaning on 3 out of 10 if you position 0 as the socialist scale and 10 as the free market side. Okay, so what you end up getting there is a roundup of these two. You get a 4.5 type of scenario.
I will push it harder. I would say that the slowdown has been a direct result of, we have no literal proof of this, but the slowdown has been a direct result of the empowerment of the parliament.
Well, yeah, my point here goes above the parliamentary agreements because the composition of the commission is also following this power sharing model. So to me, it's not so much about enhancing. I never bought into this whole legitimacy scenario or where, okay, every single position needs to be voted. Careful with that because you end up having the Mexican judicial reform where even the judges are being voted.
But the parliament has to approve the commission.
That's your point, and I agree with it. I never saw a democratic deficit to begin with. I think that some of the changes that were done were positive and some were not. But my critique here is against the overarching element that pits EU policy as an alignment of PP, the Popular Party, and the Social Democratic Party. This permeates everything. It happens in the European Parliament whenever there is a big vote coming, they side together and they just shield off any other sort of sensibilities. They don't vote together as much as they used to in the Parliament, but still. But then in the Commission, what you end up having is power sharing. Mm-hmm. For example, the Commissioner for Energy Transition is a Spanish socialist who is responsible for not building the dams that would have prevented the floodings in Valencia, for as much as she cares about the consequences of climate change. More than 200 people died because dams were not built under her watch that could have stopped these floodings. She's also the one that is shutting down nuclear plants. And now she's being sandwiched by commission bureaucrats that are better than her, surely. So she has not been able to stop nuclear energy push across the EU. But still, you have a socialist in Europe that is predominantly leading conservative, and they don't get conservative policies because the conservatives themselves insist on enacting watered-down coalition type of deals. It's like the big coalition in Germany, failed experiment, reproduced for all 300 million of us Spaniards. And then they get surprised that alt-right parties are going up, that Eurosceptic parties are going up. Well, if you're voting in a European election, why is the vote for these parties bigger in a European election? Some people say it's because it's lower turnout. Okay, that could be a factor. I agree. But it's also because if you're a center-right voter and you're considering PP and Vox, in the case of Spain or similar parties across the EU spectrum, if you want to move the European projects to the right, you vote for the alt-right party. You may not vote for the alt-right party locally, but you vote for the alt-right. And that power-sharing agreement is never discussed, and it's at the heart of all of these problems. And lately, some of the few reasons why Europe has started changing track in many of these areas, like overregulation, AI Act, deforestation regulation, GDPR, all of this nonsense that has been on the table, contested by corporations, by scholars, by intellectuals, by everyone except them, it has only started to move when the last parliamentary election for the European Parliament showed even a bigger swing. And now finally, it seems as if the European Popular Party is starting to get into some agreements with the alt-right.
But here's my double down on the national issue, though. The European Popular Party is not independent of the national parties. The national parties, like, for example, here in Spain, PP or CDU, in Germany, or so on, they set the tone for their European version, their European people when they go to the parliament. And that enforce filters through every other European institution. But if the national governments themselves and national parties themselves actually don't care, actually do not want hardcore liberalization home, it doesn't happen in the EU either.
Yeah, that's a McCloskey take for sure. You need ideas to change first. And I would agree with that. But do not underestimate the fact that it is a German ruled project in many areas. So, for example, the European Popular Party or the European Social Democrats, just by sheer size and.
No, hold on. Size, sure, but they cannot approve anything without, for example, Spain. If,
That is, yeah.
for example, Spain PP locally really cared about actual liberalization and have a flip where they must then also push it in the EU, the CDU has no influence at all on that. It's completely a choice of PP to not be liberal.
But there is a recurrent topic internally and a growing frustration within the European Popular Party because of how the German position, which is always very. This comes from, I mean, why was the European project started? To prevent another war between Germany and France. Why was every agreement done in order to tie their economies together? Bastiat, right? If goods don't come across borders, it will be soldiers doing so, right? So that's the theory. And that mentality has remained ingrained in the policymaking, especially of the Germans. And internally, both groups, and this is also a case for the center left, both groups also pinpoint to the same situation. We can't move without the Germans. They are in this Stockholm syndrome of having to always get the agreement from the Germans when the Germans should be considered, of course, as a key partner, size and history and whatnot, but they shouldn't be the only defining factor. I must say, however, that to me, one of the bigger frustrations is the lost opportunity that the two large southern economies have forgone in the last few years. And I think this is something that you and I have never spoken about, but that has been subtly in some of our conversations about this. At the end of the day, when the Eurozone was designed, the inputs by Aznar and Prodi and Berlusconi in Italy were very relevant because Spain was punching according to its weight and even above its weight under Aznar. And Italy, first Berlusconi, then Prodi, then against Berlusconi, was relevant at the European level. For the last 20 years or so, Spain has been irrelevant in international policy by own choice. Mm-hmm. This is our doing. This has nothing to do with Brussels. So as I'll spare any criticism to Brussels here because it's not anything to be put into blame rather than Spain. We had Zapatero, who decided to be a lobbyist for Venezuela. Now, professionally, he's a lobbyist for Venezuelan government and companies. But before that, as a prime minister, the first thing he did is not standing up to the American flag as it was doing a parade, just like many other countries were part of a parade honoring Spain. Since then, everything went downhill. Spain's influence in Washington came crashing down. Spain's influence across Europe came crashing down. Okay, some people thought, well, he's a socialist. George W. Bush is a conservative. Wrong. Aznar had a great working relationship with Tony Blair, Labour leader in the UK, and Bill Clinton in the US. So it's not about party lines. But okay, then Obama came. What happened? Nothing. Same thing, same irrelevance. And Rajoy came in. Quite honestly, he had to deal with such shit show from the socialist administration that he had to essentially focus on that. But again, foreign policy wasn't that ambitious. And now what we have is Pedro Sanchez, who is essentially the friend of Nicolas Maduro, who's regularly done everything in his power to just slow down the type of hard line that Trump has successfully launched against Venezuela. So it's our doing. It's our doing, 100%. Don't put this on Brussels because it's our doing. The Italians can say a very similar story. For all his faults, Berlusconi is the only political leader that was able to structure working coalitions through the years in Italy. Since then, now we have this very symbolic figure in Giorgia Meloni. She seems to be able to get the three groups of the center-right together, and she seems to be punching according to Italy's weight in the world and in Europe, even above. Right. And I like that. And I would hope and expect that sort of a southern cluster of countries that can push for, because to be precise, and I close, I went a bit long-winded there. If Spain and Italy stand together on things, nothing gets done in Europe. And we have completely forgone that power. I was just going to say and that. Just accepted what the Germans and French said.
Spain at least in number 3 and number 4. Yeah. You heard of both size and economy strength. So literally, yes, if Spain and Italy says no, it is literally no.
Yeah. But we don't act like that. We have the cards.
We have the cards.
To use the Trump language. And we have not used these cards for 20 years. And by the way, again, I insist not to blame EU here. By the way, Berlusconi's last term, he was relevant at the EU level too. And that's why some European leaders were very uncomfortable with him because he knew we would fight back on
Right.
things. And when Italy was going through a large fiscal crisis, which he inherited, they made their movements to kind of have him all there was in their power to give him a nice way out and just have a new government in power. And since then, where did Italy's influence go? Nowhere. Up until now.
Exactly. And just to make the point clear so people are
In my mind, I call
what,
this the Mediterranean Union. It's like a union within the
and
union.
in Greece also.
Yeah, well, Greece has been the best reformer of the last few years. You asked me this once, which government would you say is like, of course, we think of Argentina and don't know, but Greece has been doing very well. And Portugal has been quite a reformist country for the last 15 years. So, yeah, why not? Sure. I mean, we've taken so much from the northern states.
True.
Some of their advice was needed and positive, and some was actually quite bad. But anyway, we have a stake. Why not use it?
Yeah. So just to make it explicit, so how we mentioned QMV, qualified majority voting, it requires both population weight and numerical member state count. So if you have large populations, it did two things. One, it prevents the large countries from just dominating everything. Because you need more than just a large population. You need also like a few. You need I should know the numbers off the top of my head by now.
I studied this 15 years ago, so you spare me the. But I believe it was 14 out of the 27 states, more or less.
Yeah, I think like two.
But it needs to weigh at least 2/3 of the population.
65% population.
Yeah.
Yes. So you need those tools. It kind of counterweights
Walking
each
majority.
other. Exactly.
Yeah.
So if Spain and Italy, sure, very large countries by population, come together, it can block more things than QMV. Because you just need a few of those to join in to numerically count, and you can block everything.
Yeah.
So if you have ideological alignment with the Spanish president and the Italian president, tossing the Portuguese president for good measure, nothing could go forward without actually good faith. And that is a very powerful thing. But then the parties within these countries also do not really have any particularly strong vision of reform or liberalization domestically. So nothing can reflect each other. You mentioned Aznar, but Aznar in Spain was doing a lot of reform at the same time. So of course, at the European level, he's going to push that kind of thing.
And he used that stake. There's a great book, but it's not available in English, called España en primer plano. Can translate that as saying Spain as a key player. And by Alejandro Muñoz Alonso, the author. And it recounts many of the negotiations that were ongoing in the EU and how Aznar would routinely, punch according to Spain's weight. Ultimately, many would argue he punched way above its weight. But what he was using was essentially just using this power to just, okay, you folks want to do this, we don't agree. And my Italian friends, whether Berlusconi or Prodi, my Italian friends and I don't agree. So, change my mind. And he would there's a famous picture of him just blocking Helmut Kohl and Jacques Chirac. You can see the picture how all the European leaders are essentially surrounding him and trying to pressure him, and the man wouldn't budge. So I would hope for the better of not just Southern European economies, but also of the EU project in itself, that these coalitions would function better. Because, Aznar was a powerful figure. Berlusconi had a lot of influence. Also, Mario Draghi, I think, is a very respected figure these days. And he, of course, is a former Italian prime minister, not just the former president of the ECB. And so is Enrico Letta, who was a very quick, short-lived prime minister. But beyond the Draghi report about Europe's decay and how to kickstart it again, there's another very relevant report as well called the Letta report, which was also compiled under a former Italian prime minister, Enrico Letta. And this is not, by the way, a South versus North thing, because I was routinely on the side of the Germans in the Euro crisis. And I was even billed, yeah, you're Merkel's boy. One guy told me once, I was younger, so I guess the boy comment did make sense. I was like 22. But you're Merkel's boy, just saying whatever the Germans want to happen here in the southern countries. I remember that public debate once. And since then, many things have changed. And German policy has certainly taken a turn for the worst. And we have just bought that and followed that. And it's a problem. And I guess that some of the issue here is that, okay, national politics are not good. Why should European politics be better? Why blame Europe? Well, not blame Europe, but restrict it, because if national politics are not very good, if we have overarching structure that can reproduce many of these vices, then that's what worries me.
But that is the thing, I guess I am saying. The European project post, Lisbon, in 2008 has become a slightly different project. And you need to realize that the national government or a national population, national politics drives European politics. People can't keep, Brussels does not act sui generis. It's more comforting to think it does. It makes the argument a bit more nice sounding, but it doesn't act that way because everything stems from the European governments themselves. If you had France with a good president, Germany with a good president, Italy and Spain, Europe would be amazing. That's just factual, it's true.
Mm.
Because they will push everything else towards a particular direction.
However, I believe have a more of a romantic view that I would recommend on the ability of the commission to just stay above these vices.
No. Hold on. I am not saying the commission can stay above. I am saying the commission has its own incentives, but the creature of the treaties.
There it is, creature. You said it.
I win. It's true. It's a creature of the treaties.
I agree.
And treaties are creatures of national governments.
Let's.
This is the main point I'm making.
But let's do this. Let's take the commission at its own word. It agreed it would do a deregulation strategy. When did it do this? 6 years ago, 8 years ago, roughly, right? Well, to be honest, Juncker, who was the president before, he has this amazing quote from the years in which Europe was dealing with a huge debt crisis and governments were on the brink of going bankrupt across the entire EU. And he gave this amazing quote and he said, "We all know what we need to do to get out of this. We just don't know how to get reelected if we do it." And I thought that was a very smart, from a public choice, look, that's such a fantastic take on things. And he was very blunt when he said this. And I like Juncker.
He's good.
I like Juncker. Yeah. He was a great prime minister of Luxembourg.
Yeah.
And I think many of the current problems are leadership problems because under Juncker, some of the green agenda was slowed down. Again, was still put forward because of insisting on the coalition. I would have fancied myself a Juncker with parliamentary support from the alt-right groups, which, by the way, by then were a lot less fringe than many of them are these days. But if you don't listen to actual legitimate claims for change, then you get more radicalization. That's something that is to blame on the European authorities. But then when von der Leyen came on board, she said, okay, we'll do a deregulation strategy. Nothing happened.
But pause that. Luis Garicano had a good piece where he made this point explicitly that I thought was quite obvious.
Very pro-EU and very interesting author.
Yeah, very pro-EU. But I think almost like he's an EU terrorist, I believe, also. Very pro-EU.
Yeah, he's a former MEP.
Yeah.
And you can follow his Silicon Continent blog on Substack. I would recommend it. Yeah.
He wrote an article on that blog where he mentioned, well, the von der Leyen is a result of power in the sense that she was not the person that was supposed to become the president of the commission because of the whole Spitzenkandidat process that the EU invented. The European groups had their person put forward as Max Weber.
Yes.
From the EPP.
Or hearings in the parliament where you need to get confirmed and voted in.
No, when they were running the election. It was known that Weber was going to be the president.
Yes, correct. Right. We go to the polls here.
Correct.
We'll vote locally in each party. In each country, we choose one party or another. But all main parties signal who they would choose as their future leader of the commission.
The guy. But he was not recommended by the council to be the head of the commission because, as Garicano had pointed out, I think correctly, the council was worried that Weber would actually be too good and have too much control and be too powerful at the commission. And that would actually attack their power base in their domestic politics. So that's why they refused to nominate, and it's the council that has to nominate the president for the commission, and then the parliament has to confirm. So it's very odd. So they refused to nominate Max Weber. So what they did, they nominated von der Leyen, who was just non-threatening to them.
Yes.
That was correct. She has no ability to do anything.
She was a
failed minister.
A failed minister under the failing Merkel cabinet. Whereas Weber...
But it comes to the point. They knew. The national governments knew.
Yes.
That they didn't want to actually get rid of power.
Yeah. It was both the national government and also the socialists were signaling that they were smelling the blood, and they immediately said, no, if we want to keep this agreement going, we need someone that is more willing to compromise. And again, this circles back to the topic that I was raising of this power-sharing arrangement, which just boils down a lot of policy to nothing, and it never gets called out.
Right.
Vox in Spain, the alt-right party, is doing so. They very often leave PP facing its own inconsistencies. So you'll see PP, for example, saying that they oppose something here, and they will then get criticized by Vox for being actually partially the originators of said policy, because said policy perhaps began with an agreement between the European Popular Party and the Socialist Party, which then was used by the local authorities in Spain, who are socialists, to probably gold plate and put some bunch of unnecessarily stuff into that regulation, which boils down to the problem that they say they want to get rid of, although they were originally involved in introducing that legislation. I don't know if our listeners are following me here, but what I mean is that if you insist on sharing power with the socialists, and you water down your own agenda just to keep the EU process non-partisan, you end up creating a huge problem of disaffection with the institutions. You are essentially the reason why, I would even argue, Brexit, a lot of Brexit dynamics are the result of that, because when it was a European Economic Community, as it was named, whenever Thatcher or her successors would call for a rebate, some flexibility, not being included in something, just not making it a one-size-fits-all and a federal, quasi-federal sort of push, they would get their way. All voices were heard. The project was advancing. It had its hurdles. And my European looks a lot like what Margaret Thatcher's did. However, out of that same Tory party came the push for a Brexit vote that happened under a prime minister who he himself did not stand for Brexit, but many in the Tories did. Certainly, their leader at the European Parliament, Daniel Hannan, a friend of mine, was in that camp for sure.
Incorrectly.
Yes, I fought him respectfully whenever that topic arises. But then you come back to these days, and the Brits are not involved anymore. And that's also a problem for the EU, because
the Tory party is gone, yeah.
Yeah. Well, but just the Brits overall. The fact that there was British MPs meant that those that sat right of the center were a lot more free market leaning MPs, and those that sat on the center to the left were traditionally less leftists than others in continental Europe.
Sure, that's also true. Yeah, good point.
So that hurt the project, and it's never discussed, because it's always posited out, well, they want it out, they're not doing well, so they're lost. It's also our loss. Yeah. I think everyone, both the UK and the EU, lost as a result of that.
That comes out also in the court. A lot of the judges and the advocate generals and the law cases that were more liberalization focused were from the UK. Mm-hmm. That is a fact. And one point you mentioned, though, about the power sharing dynamic, I wanted to make this point I think is important, which is the socialist parties in the European Parliament have to be voted to there. They don't just appear randomly. That means the higher number of them in the European Parliament shows that the local elections are being won more by socialist people. But it means the liberals are losing. I'm like, why can't liberals actually fight harder locally to win more share of the European elections? That's also a point that people kind of gloss over. It's not some natural tendency that they're going to have so many more left-wing people in the parliament. They have to win the seats. So when the local elections happen and liberals can't actually convince people they should be more powerful, that is also failing of liberal politics.
It's true that there is a relevant number of left-wing MEPs, and that's a reflection of a political reality that is there. But if we factor in the different groups in the parliament that can be considered to be center-right, hardcore right, alt-right, you get the European Popular Party, which is the largest. Mm-hmm. You get the European Conservatives and Reformists. You get Patriots for Europe group. There's a smaller one as well. That rounds up to ESN, yeah. That rounds up to 52%. I'm crunching the numbers as we speak. And then if you do the same thing with the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the left, you get 33. And in the center, you get Renew Europe, which is a Macron platform that you can consider to be a centrist platform, but would probably lean right more than left in most cases. And if you factor that in, you have a 50% share for the right-wing parties, a 30% share for the left-wing parties, and a 10% share for the liberals or the moderate liberals. And there's a 10% of non-aligned candidates that just stood for election for not very political reasons, but other
it's right. Small. It has IND also. It has sovereigns like far right,
yes.
quote unquote far right.
Yes. Let's call those more on the deplorable side, right, of things, to use the Clinton terminology. But I'm saying here is that you get two MEPs from right-wing or liberal parties for every one MEP you get on the socialist front. So I think Europe is more conservative than it is allowing itself to be. And I don't advocate for them to just overrule the socialists on everything. By the way, the Popular Party or their allies, that's not necessarily always my platform, especially on social issues. There could be some differences. The economic policy very often could also be lacking enough economic freedom. There's a lot of protectionist right as well. We're seeing that with the Mercosur trade agreement and the opposition to it. But just overall, Europe has denied itself the type of policies that the European voters have advocated for. And that is one of the reasons why the share of the vote for the center-right groups has increased, but the traditional center-right has lost support, and the alternative rights have seen their
But I think
votes go
the
up.
root of that loss is the priorities of the national parties themselves. The Pepe government is not starkly liberal reformists at home. They're not going that way also in the European Union.
But you could argue that the alt-right groups, everything that has popped up to the right of the traditional center-right, those are the answer to that, 100%.
I agree, but as I said, the political priorities now on the national level, the Vox and the Chega in Portugal and the AFD in Germany and the Sense Party called it
Reassemble Nationale, right?
Yes, in France.
National Reassembling.
Yes.
That's not a good translation. It was the National Front for ages.
Right, but it's different word now, but same thing. Yeah, they are why, and that's showing how politics works. And until you have just a rationalization of national priority to the European priority, you're going to have this disjointed way of policy. But at the end of the day, if the national governments themselves do not have priorities towards liberalization, they're never going to have EU priorities towards liberalization. And many people say, oh, Brussels does X, Brussels does... Well, no, Brussels don't do anything.
Yeah, it does permeate all the way up to
my point is, the Commission as a bureaucracy has its own incentives, and some are perverted, of course. But they can be controlled because they actually have no independent power.
But let me also say, and I was bringing up von der Leyen's name before to have a deeper discussion about this, that when the Draghi report was released, and the Letta report was also put out, there was a interesting conversation, sort of a dawning moment. It felt like a dawning moment because the numbers were just startling. It showed, these are two reports, but the fact that they were drafted by former Italian prime ministers, and in the case of Mario Draghi, someone who is very prestigious and who was also the head of the ECB, and kind of a magician, because just when he was signaling he would do whatever it takes, he shrunk the balance sheet of the ECB instead of doing the contrary. So some nice central bank alchemy there, playing with words and expectations. There was even a slightly deflationary period as this was going on, whereas you would have expected massive money printing and inflation. But not to go off topic once again, I'm just bringing this up because then when these reports came out, Europe suddenly realized that it was falling behind the US and that it was falling behind China. And it was just slowly its economy and population are just dying, right? So this reflection, which would seem obvious in think tank circles, in intellectual circles, took ages to be accepted. This view that Europe was failing and not succeeding was challenging the groupthink of all the Brussels bureaucrats, as well as the national leaders. And to be honest, then Brussels did react and published a competitiveness compass.
Garbage.
Which was the worst possible take on the Draghi report. Not everything on the Draghi report was good or perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but there was some good in it. The compass left out most of the good and took in most of the bad and amplified it. And that is on von der Leyen. But even worse...
Wait. Hold on.
What are you telling me? It was national governments drafting the compass now?
Hold on.
You have some inside info?
Hold on. Yes, the compass bullcrap was von der Leyen, sure. But the major issues of anti-competitive behavior in the member states are member state problems.
Yeah.
Like 98% of the problems are member state.
Yet Draghi knows this. But Draghi knows this. And when he created his report, he does not advocate for things that the EU can't do. He does suggest some things.
It's for the EU.
Yes. So when the EU explicitly decides to leave out some of the good, keep on most of the bad, and then just amplify it, and then present a compass, and then does not implement its own compass, because the results are in. And in year one, since the compass was released, Compass was the document that was supposedly essentially taking in whatever Draghi had said and what they were thinking and committing to a reduction. So one very, like I don't think we've shared this on the podcast. I guess it wasn't relevant, but I have a smaller thing. We bring up the Juan de Mariana think tank in Spain, which is a leading voice for free market in the Hispanic world, not just in Spain. I have a smaller organization as well, Foro Regulación Inteligente, which focuses on deregulation. So I was laser focused on this because they, for instance, promised to cut 35% of existing regulation affecting small and medium-sized companies and 25% of the regulatory burden on large companies. Up to this point, after a year and a half, they have only enacted 15% of the changes they wanted done. So they are dragging their feet after essentially just committing themselves to doing little and bad.
They are dragging their feet because they have no external pressure.
Yes, okay. But
they have the internal incentive to not do anything.
Then there is a problem with that structure whatsoever, regardless of the external.
No. I am not saying the commission is a good organization. I am saying the commission is controlled by the national powers.
And I'm just
my point.
Because many of these,
you can't expect people who are literally not directly elected to respond to elections.
And let me tell you one thing about Europe actually pursuing or not pursuing action. The lack of action is sometimes not bad for national policy. Mm-hmm. Like if you have a government that is not kind of laissez-faire and just leaves things be. That's why Spain recovered under Rajoy. Wasn't that Rajoy did crazy liberalization? He did a bit of a stabilization, should have done it better. Some liberalization, but only focused on the labor market, which was hemorrhaging, and then just let things be for 6 years. And guess what? The economy was doing quite well. 3% growth, 500,000 new jobs every year. Size of the government came down 46 to 38% of GDP. If you ask me, like the results were actually pretty good. So the laissez-faire attitude to government is not necessarily bad. But when you say you're committing to doing something and you don't do it, you lose credibility.
I think the issue is this, however. Many of these things pointed out in the Draghi report that are more corrosive to competition are things that the EU does not control. Mm-hmm. For example, most of the trade barriers that the member states have are
internal,
but are the biggest thing.
Perhaps to stop you there for a second, I think we should acknowledge that because sometimes it's assumed that we have the single market. We have a single market in name only. And there was a significant integration of regulations as a way to simplify them and make them coherent so that you could trade goods and services and capital could flow, not just human, but also just financial capital as well, without restrictions. But to this date, many of those advances have remained there, thankfully, but no further progress has been done. I always recall this story of getting in. I was flying to the UK. I was 17 years old. I was going to a boarding school to spend a month there, trying to perfect my English. And a magazine by Iberia, the airline, Spanish airline, featured an article about how the flight control was fragmented across all EU member states. And how if you integrated that, you could save time, save money, and save emissions. So I recall that when I was 17 years ago. I was reading about that. It just made sense to me. I wasn't very political at this time. I'm 17, but the whole scheme that he was proposing made sense. Then it was given a name, Single European Sky. 20 years later, we're still waiting.
Yeah, that is true.
Banking union, capitals union.
But all of these things are not EU sui generis problems. These are member states not wanting to move forward. And if the member state themselves don't want to move forward, there's no motion forward. But somehow this is still put as a Brussels bubble thing. I'm not saying they want to move forward. They probably are different. But the member states are the ones that control the vote on those things.
Yeah, no, I'll admit that.
The banking union. The banking union, for an actual banking union, requires a single banking regulator. That is impossible in the current treaty. Who controls the treaty? The member state have to vote a new change in the treaty. Same for the Capital Markets Union. When Juncker Commission in 2010 proposed the first real policy for doing the commission, the Capital Market Union, what's required? The member state has to give up a lot of regulatory power. They have to vote and change the treaty to confer this power to the EU institutions. None of this happens.
Not disputing that, but when the push that Brussels does is not for banking union, It's not for the capitals union.
Because
it's for not for a single market.
can't.
It's for energy transition.
Yeah. Because those are easy things to talk about. Remember, they still, again, their bureaucracy internally still have to do something to justify their existence, right?
Yeah, well,
so if the member states don't actually allow the bureaucracy to actually work productively, they're going to work counterproductively.
I think they react
because they have no
partially
direct power over this.
Yeah, but again, like they were going nowhere with many of the regulations they proposed, and they knew that, and they still went ahead and did it. Why is it not a priority to introduce more freedom in the markets? Well, I would argue that there's a split the corp. The workers in the commission, they are apt and very prepared, very cosmopolitan bureaucrats compared to other public servants in other. But there is a prevailing socialist mentality there. And there is a lack of accountability for what they do because there is a federalist obsession in the way they view the European project. And whatever they can do to justify integration, they will do, even though sometimes Europe is stronger if it doesn't get federalized in what it is doing.
The things
there is
that
strength in the decentralized model as well.
The things that would strengthen, let's say you are a pure, hardcore EU federalist.
Oh, okay. God knows there's a few of those.
The things that you want to happen, for example, the banking union, insurance union, pension union, capital union, you would want those things to happen too. But they're not happening.
Yeah, but again, the push...
Because the power isn't in your department.
Non-existent push from the commission, though. Non-existent.
I agree. This current von der Leyen commission.
No, absolutely. But this commission has been in power for... how long has it been now? It's 6 years, right?
But the von der Leyen commission is trash. I mentioned that the president of the commission is trash, right? Then you had Juncker, you had someone that had views, that had vision, that had policy, that had principles.
Which therefore speaks poorly of the bureaucracy, because if everything swings depending on the political leadership...
I think the bureaucracy in commission, all these too intense, is too dare, too all these bad words you can use. But at the end of the day, who appoints the college? It's not the bureaucracy. It is the national governments and the parliament that appoint the college of the commission.
Also, when we speak about the commission, it is true.
And I would say it's kind of a good sign to me that the bureaucracy is so dependent on the college to do things. It actually shows they're not that independent.
One thing I would also bring forward to the debate is that when you're talking about EU bureaucrats, they are sometimes positioned to be independent from their member states. Many of the lower and middle ranking bureaucrats, those that are not politically appointed, are. And they share this group thing that is very technical, very federalist. I can appreciate the effectiveness that they may have, or the attention to detail that these workers have. I also don't appreciate the lack of an overarching liberalization strategy in most of their proposals, but I mean, there's some good and bad there. However, most of the politically appointed higher ranking bureaucrats, not the commissioner, which is also another example, but especially those below, there are national government loyalties involved there.
For sure.
And that is a problem as well, because you may have a position where the bureaucracy has crafted something, for example, to free up some of the budget that is currently being spent on agricultural subsidies, and use it in a definitely smarter way than just subsidizing the entire primary sector. Still, if the farmers in France oppose that, and if there is a French high-ranking official in the EU Commission, he will not be thinking of what his team is telling him or what the overarching goal set by the Commission and under mandate is, but rather they will be voting among
That's my point. It comes back to the politics and the politicians.
And I will share an anecdote now.
Before you share that, before we leave bureaucracy thing, in Spain, you have these intense opposiciones exams to enter the most prestigious parts of the public sector. The public service here is extremely well trained in terms of technical knowledge, crazily well trained because of these exams. And yet we live in Spain. We know what happens in Spain.
Not an effective public service at all.
Because the government still controls the rail power.
No, I'm just saying this. I'm not saying it's different than national governments, but some people argue it is. They make this claim that, well, the European bureaucracy is, more cosmopolitan, more international, less dependent on national governments. It's like if they were aliens.
I mean, they make that false argument all the time.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I will share an anecdote now. There was a high profile case where the commission had to rule whether some payment by the Spanish government would be considered or not a form of state aid, whether it would distort competition or it would be a reasonable payment that could be legally handed by the government to a company. My view in that case is that we were talking about compensation. So compensation for some regulatory changes should not be seen as state aid of any kind. I believe that's the doctrine of the commission, because otherwise, anytime a government pays compensation for any wrongdoing, you could argue that is state aid if the recipient of it it's a large company or whatever. And the whole conversation could become a lot more convoluted. So in this particular case, the Spanish government did not want this to be considered compensation, but wanted it to be seen as state aid. And the person in charge of the bureaucratic service of the commission in the legal services was a Spaniard. And this Spaniard essentially said, okay, we will label this state aid because this closed doors to my face. We will label this state aid because that's what Pedro Sanchez has told us to do. And we will not oppose any sort of agreement between the Sanchez government and the companies should they decide to do it the other way. Taking the romance out of the equation, when you look at how these things work internally, you find there's a lot of very cynical situations like this that remind you, okay,
But
we're still
I don't
talking.
find that to be a cynical situation. I find it to be a direct point.
If you just if you
No.
rule it state aid,
Yeah.
you can't just walk out and tell me
here's
it's
my-
state aid, but I won't call it state aid if you
Here's
don't
my-
want me to.
Here's my thing. My thing is this. My overarching view or argument is the European Union bureaucracy is dependent on the politicians of the European member states in 95% of policy. To me, it's obvious that if you have a Spanish person high ranking in the European Commission and they have party loyalties, 'cause it's politics, they will respond to the party, the politicians.
Yes, but
Nothing about
when-
that to me is
when-
outside ordinary.
But when this bureaucracy is explained to you in class, in the media, when it explains itself, it is as if they came from Mars, and they are completely
and
objective and neutral. And
Clearly,
that's
clearly
crap.
crazy.
That's about-
There is no such thing as a neutral bureaucracy.
Exactly.
Primarily because bureaucracies don't control themselves.
That's why those on the pro-EU side of the spectrum where I find myself
I'm pro-EU.
would not be as idealistic whenever they present the capabilities of the project. That would be a big step forward. Among other things, because I was speaking about the identity thing, the push for identity, the intention to make this the United States of Europe. That doesn't fly with many voters. It doesn't with me, to be honest, although I am pro-EU generally speaking. And the more the emphasis has been, I would argue that the European authorities, European government bodies have put all the right emphasis in all the wrong places for the last 10 years. And that takes a toll on any project.
But that happens when the top governing body, the European Council, just lets things flutter around.
And also, Eurozone. That's for a long episode. But Eurozone. There are some criteria for joining the Eurozone and whatnot, but essentially it's like free rules of the game come in, low inflation, low deficit, low debt. And once you're in, you have to keep meeting these criteria. They don't just go away. It was originally known as the Maastricht criteria. It was then revised, but the rules of the game never really changed. They were 3% government deficit tops, 60% government debt tops, and inflation should be significantly low, below 2%. At least that's what some people consider low. I consider it low to be 0%. That's price stability, but that's for another topic. So Europe is dealing in between 2008 and 2013 with a significant debt crisis. Governments routinely break these commitments. Nothing ever happens. It is said that the European protocols will kick in and the authorities will make sure that these violations of the rules of the euro will not be maintained through the years. Here is Spain still today breaking the rules of the Eurozone, which it started to break in 2008 and has not met a single year since, and nothing happens. With the pandemic, the rules get even more relaxed, but then they don't get brought up as they were originally. They get even more watered down. And when a program is placed for reform in Greece, it takes 3 different bailouts to actually get serious about what should be done. So the governance of that crisis took a huge toll on the image of the EU, which was seen as unable to meet its own rules, continuously bailing out failed economies. and creating this north-south divide that still permeates today in some dynamics.
But what's the argument you're making?
Argument I'm making is that the bigger tool for economic integration deployed by the European project was the Eurozone, the single currency, and the fact that all single currency rules were violated by member states. And the governing body of the Eurozone decided not to act, not to do anything. In fact, got the Commission together with the IMF and the ECB in itself to just bail out these countries and keep going as if nothing had happened, took a big toll on the overall goal of connecting the European economy closer. And I think the governance could have been worse. You had national leaders like Merkel
I don't think that
getting their
I
hands.
don't think that reads true. I don't agree with the policies they did it or it crisis, but to me,
Some of them were good. Like ask Portuguese,
sure.
or
But
Malta.
my point though is that it doesn't.
Or
To
Cyprus,
me,
sorry.
it has
Cyprus.
in some ways strengthened the credibility of the integration project because they're willing to sacrifice their own rules to enable the sustainability of other member states. I think that should not have been the case. You should have allowed the defaults on Greece and so on. But then that would have actually then caused more probably spite from these member states.
I mean, I don't think Brexit was the.
No. There was never a situation where that. But no.
It was just the governance of this bailout program.
They shouldn't have had bailout program. They
To
should
begin with.
allow the default.
In fact, it was clearly stated on the EU project and its economic regulations on the Eurozone crafting and whatnot that it was a monetary union, not a fiscal transfer union.
Yeah.
By the way, fiscal union, another typical obsession that I've left out now in some of this debate, but I did bring it up in the beginning, the obsession with creating its own revenue sources, the fiscal union and whatnot. Well, these are all the Euro bonds, by the way, pooling together resources to issue debt collectively, which sounds good if you want to lower your cost of borrowing. But at the same time, if you're a profligate government that is doing deficit spending, why should another EU member that is being austere and managing its deficit properly, why should it be bailing you out by allowing you to get into the same pool of financial claims into a debt issuance? I think that makes no sense. And that's a common topic among European elites. They love that project, the Euro bonds and the Euro.
Okay, but if the situation with Greece is instructive in the situation where they should have allowed a default, so Greece will be forced to do actual fiscal reform, right? That should have been the priority.
Took them 3 bailouts, only at the third one, and after a default, technically there was a default on a payment.
Not a proper default. To be a proper default, because how it was phrased at that time was, okay, if Greece did not use the euro, they had the drachma still, they could do some kind of monetary refinancing, blah, 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 bullcrap. Because, of course, if you had drachma, you'd be worse off. But you can default with the euro, but do a fiscal review, not just monetary adjustment. And that's what they were so afraid of.
Yeah. And by the way, as soon as Greece got serious about reform, it's doing very well.
Yeah.
So has Portugal, so has Ireland, so has Cyprus. But all the bailed out countries have done well.
But therefore,
the way in which the governance, because most governments were acknowledged the problem and committed to reform. Ireland surely did, as a beacon of free market policies. The Portuguese took it very seriously under Passos Coelho, and then the socialists came in under Antonio Costa, and they were very good, very rigorous. But the Greek were not, and the European governance could have not been worse. The handling of the crisis was horrible, and the political cost of dragging this thing out for ages through 3 different prime ministers, Papandreou, and there was another one. And then
Greece at the time still, they didn't want to pull the trigger on their own reforms. Greece still, as you know, the other member states could not force Greece to do fiscal cuts.
Yet Greece could not force other countries to bail them out, and yet they seemingly were willing to.
I agree. I thought the bailouts were a bad idea.
I would never use this kind of arguments normally, but I think that if you had been in Europe during those years, and I know you followed this and read about this, but if you had been present, the level of animosity, frustration, just struggling of the entire European project at this point was, I cannot put it into words, the stress that the entire European project came under, just because many of these tensions have relaxed themselves over time. But the Greek saga was damaging to the project, 100%. By the way, there was a neo-Nazi and a communist party creeping up in an election in Greece. So
Yes.
that's kind of telling you something.
I remember this well. I wasn't in Greece, I wasn't, in
Mhm.
Spain, but I remember this very well. But that goes to the point, though, is that because the European project cannot force a national government to do national things, and because they want to seem so collegiate, just in their view, saving the union is more important. No, yeah, they're going to make these bad policies because Merkel, at a time, she had bad views about how this should work. It goes back to her still too.
Oh, Merkel.
These people have to make their own choices, and they made the wrong choice, but that's what their political ideology told them to do.
Yeah. Well, you were even more dismissive than I was about von der Leyen.
Mhm.
And here is the other elephant in the room, Angela Merkel, a national leader, not an EU leader,
Right.
but by all matters and purposes, the key politician in Europe for the previous decade. And she also happens to be a CDU, the European Popular Party group in Germany. So again, these two German ladies have certainly made no favors to the European project.
Yeah. But I keep trying to stress this point for the episode is that no matter how you cut this cake, it comes back to the powerful countries, powerful leaders as their political view.
Mm-hmm.
If Angela Merkel wants to do a bailout will happen.
I mean, if Javier Milei was the president of Germany,
exactly. That's my point.
Maybe things would be looking for
very
sure
different.
However, one could argue that just because European policies these days are not very good, the fact that there is this other structure that replicates this, it's to be also seen as an issue.
But see,
not as a necessary evil, but
why
also as part of the same evil.
Is what I keep saying. If you really want to change EU policy, what you should do is focus on your national legislature.
On your national
legislature.
Yeah.
If your political party at home, especially if you're in a big country, if your political party has better people in the party, then that reflects everything else changes. Nothing compensates for bad leadership at home, even in the EU.
I guess the recent conflict, or I don't know how to put it, but just a spat over Greenland has also been a relevant point to highlight how our defense capabilities, which are not an EU task in itself, have been delegated to NATO through the years. But when you look at the NATO membership, it's essentially Europe, the US, throw in the Canadians, and add the Turkish, but it's essentially the EU and the US. And the fact that the EU is not able to not just fulfill the promises of NATO.
When you say the EU, the European member states.
Yeah, the member states. Not just not following up on their commitments to NATO, but not even getting along with their other partner in NATO, which is the US. I think both sides should be thinking about this, and not just the Americans. A lot has been made up of how Trump's ways have been very, I don't know even how to describe them, right? But have been very negative for the relationship between Washington and Brussels and just all the member states as a result of this push to annex Greenland and the unilateral kind of bullying type of speech by Washington, right? However, again, the EU needs to reflect on the fact that, Europe, not the EU, needs to reflect on the fact that it has done nothing to advance its common European defense capabilities. There are some European defense programs within the EU, and those should be significantly ramped up in order to create a more coordinated European strategy of defense. Member states don't want to.
No, they don't want to, exactly.
And one of the things that this permeates into is that, for example, we are being asked to spend more on defense by the US government. And when you have 27 countries buying supplies, buying technology, buying aircrafts, buying goods and services needed for defense, you are missing out on all the economies of scale of bringing together 15% of the world's GDP under a single contracting dynamic. I'm not saying we should have a European army. I'm just saying
it sounds like you're saying that, Diego.
I'm saying that the resource and the coordination that is done via NATO has not been upkept by the Europeans, and that the best way to upkeep it is to increase coordination on these programs. For example, if I'm buying an aircraft by myself as a Spaniard, but there is also Estonian government, and then there's the Romanian government, and they're all buying aircrafts, and we're doing this separately, the price we get is easy 20% higher than if we were doing it. So I can give you more for less if we actually pool resources together.
This is the kind of argument that a European Federation person would say, because they say, well, if the EU could do purchases, then the European member states would actually have cheaper.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
But that requires
But
the
I was,
member
as I
states
was
to
saying, all the
change.
aggressive push by Brussels has been put in the wrong places.
Yeah, but
So,
this requires
if this was
member
a
states.
conversation, which what Trump is doing at the end of the day, some analysts have taken this view that, okay, don't trust everything Trump says. He's asking for 100 just to get to 50. So if the Europeans are doing nothing on defense and nothing on Greenland, well, if you ask for just give me 5% of GDP on defense and give me Greenland, they will actually get serious about, okay, we do need to probably spend 2 or 3% of GDP instead of just one, like is the case of Spain. And also, we will need to take care of, okay, how do we manage the situation in Greenland and what's to be done about that? And I would tend to agree that that's ultimately the outcome. Or I may not like the means to achieve to that outcome, but that's the de-escalation of the Greenland conversation in Davos would certainly point out that, okay, the Europeans got the memo and now they're starting to work on this. But hey, some elements of the European integration project, the coordination project, can be beneficial for all parties involved. And the defense capabilities are certainly one example of that. But if your whole focus is on over-regulating industry, over-regulating AI, over-regulating data protection, over-regulating
But these are
deforestation
remember,
rules that make no sense.
Diego, sometimes defense is not an EU competence at all.
No, it's not. No, I'm saying, but the whole energy has been put in the wrong places.
Because the member states have chosen where the energy goes.
Yeah, and again, it's the Americans telling us what we should be focusing on. And you could say that's patronizing and embarrassing, but
I don't think it's
it's showing the way in many areas.
It's a clear sign. Sure. It's a clear sign that the EU member states themselves still to this day don't take it seriously.
Yeah. I agree.
But this is the thing. I'm not saying you are saying this, but one cannot say, okay, this shows why the EU is like. No, the EU has no power over this topic at all.
At all.
The member states would need to then come back to the drawing board and say, hey, well,
there is such thing as a European Defense Union as a body. This exists, but it's symbolic.
Even something like this, like
Frontex,
external.
Another example of this would be the absolute lack of just strategy and effectiveness in immigration policy. Mm-hmm. This has been felt more directly by Spain and Italy and to a lower extent other smaller Mediterranean countries because they are the gateway, the entry point into the EU. So they get flooded with very big inflows of migrants coming predominantly from the Northern African region, and basic services are overwhelmed. Budgets are strained. Economic integration doesn't prove very easy because we're speaking of predominantly non-well-trained, not very highly educated, culturally not necessarily as integrated as other immigrants, to say the least. So when you consider all of this, the lack of proper EU management of this scenario from its border authorities and the lack of commitment from other EU member states to helping the recipient states has been a massive failure. And when you look at, Meloni has been the only EU leader that has spoken about immigration reform.
This is to me the issue. Meloni has been the only one to really speak up about this, but she can't control the Spain. The current prime minister of Spain doesn't really care about it.
Well, it's giving amnesty to 800,000 illegal immigrants.
If there was a better prime minister of Spain plus Meloni, different conversation.
Absolutely. And I think that there was a point in which the Brits and the Germans, plus the Nordic states, Netherlands and so on, they were a force for a more advanced, more dynamic, more open markets and open society type of model. But since the Brits have left, fatigue has kicked in. The Germans have completely gone off the rails.
French have other priorities. Their country's falling apart.
I'm leaving the French.
But Germans too, their country's falling apart. They have other priorities. Also, Frontex is severely underfunded. There's no budget for it, as we mentioned earlier, right? But who's going to give the money to Frontex? That's the whole thing itself.
The way EU money is spent is ridiculous because, as we said, there's a big chunk of it that goes to agricultural subsidies. This makes no sense. This is I wouldn't dare to say it's 1%, but it's probably less than 3-4% of GDP, and I think I'm probably overstating this. But it can be so that a very small chunk of the output that is roughly 3% of GDP gets 50% of the
budget of the EU isn't that big anyway. So one could,
but it could be for Frontex, for example. If you are able to,
you could reallocate
ramp up some of that. Oh no, not all of it. That would be
you could reallocate a lot of that agricultural funding to Frontex. But
and there is some expenditures there that go to culture, and that
should not be done.
those should go immediately because culture is a member state competence, and I don't know.
Shared competence.
Yes, but
That's why they can do it.
yes, but no one really claimed that this was like they claim that they do this to promote European culture.
Yeah.
Nah, that should be left out of the table.
Maybe now it's not. I think at the beginning, maybe I can see why at the beginning, yes, because it's a new thing. But generationally, like people grew up in Europe, that is not a thing anymore. Also, I was in Brussels recently.
Yeah, but no one grew up in Europe. You know what I mean?
No.
You grew up in your member state.
That I think is underselling. I think so because you, I'm doing math here. You really grew up in Europe because the idea,
geographically speaking.
No. But just the idea of us going other places, the idea of thinking coming to you, that is a very different mentality from your parents by default.
It is true that when you ask this question across Europe, you get a mixed bag. Some countries, people feel almost as European as they feel nationals of their own country.
The smaller ones.
The smaller ones, yes. But then again, if your country is like a mid-sized town
right.
in Spain, I get it that your national identity only takes you so far because there's countries in the EU that are smaller than Las Rozas or Boadilla, like sleeper towns close to Madrid. So like that is something to be had in this conversation. So if I was from Latvia, maybe
but even
I have my sense of national pride or culture or whatever.
But no,
I get why the European identity is more attractive.
I don't mean like pride and that kind of thing and culture. I don't mean that sense. I mean just an awareness. Like, for example, a lawyer today in Spain who is 60 years old never did a course in EU law when he was in school.
No, he didn't.
But now it is obvious that you do a lot of EU law because you just know by default so much about it. Or when you're doing econ, like you know a lot about the European economy and that kind of quote unquote idea. But before you did not. Just the latent awareness as a default perception of your life has changed substantially now that the countries are in the EU. So you might not not you, but one might not feel a cultural unity of someone in France or Germany, but you know way more about France and Germany.
I would define this as proximity, but not as a shared identity or belonging. But I must admit, I'm talking of myself here. I think this is more or less representative of the Spanish population, but the Spanish population, although they feel predominantly Spanish and also from the region, they do acknowledge a sense of European identity there. So I'm not saying it's non-existent.
I'm not even trying to make an argument about the existence or none of the European identity. I am saying something more different. I'm saying because you grew up having so much knowledge of the project and the union and the other countries.
We were schooled on this.
Right. That completely changes the idea of how people perceive other places. That's my point.
Some of the more, as we were speaking about this, I'm thinking that the Erasmus program, which essentially it's an automatic exchange of students between universities across Europe. So you strike an agreement.
Big deal.
And that is a very big deal, and it's so cheap.
That should be expanded substantially. All the cultural stuff, just pump it into Erasmus. That's my view.
Yeah, but no, absolutely. Just as Erasmus Go Share.
There was a study that was published recently, and I sent to you, where they did a estimation of the babies that came from Erasmus.
Yeah.
Right? You know why.
No, we had a different discussion on but it's connected.
The same thing. And they did it was like 1 million or so babies came from the Erasmus program. But a important point, I mean not 1 million, but a big number. Someone raised this point to me before. The kind of people that do Erasmus is structurally different from people who do not, in this sense. If you're doing Erasmus, you're likely, if you're in college, so already you're a big difference from normal people. You're in college.
Well, remember, a lot of people go to university in Europe. Not saying that's good, but I'm just saying that that's a kind of a American point of view there, because if you focus on most...
No, hold on. But
half of the youth go to the college.
But the youth now, it's a generational thing, saying like the Pueblo from before.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Generationally speaking, yes. So
you're already a different kind of person already. But then now, the kind of people within that group that choose to go to Erasmus are generally a bit more elite than general Pueblo person. Generally speaking. In Spain, sure, but definitely in other countries, France, yeah.
Many are in for the party.
That's fine too.
Yeah,
that's fine too. But still, the kind of person that goes is the kind of person that's bit more cosmopolitan,
No,
bit more
absolutely.
open. That's my point
But
I'm making.
I was going there with
And
yeah.
and importantly, the people that are going to be quote unquote the politician class, they are generally also the kind of people that do Erasmus as well.
Mhm.
Because of that, by default, and oftentimes they meet their partner on Erasmus, that's actually surprisingly common, I found out. Just by default, having the Erasmus program, having the people that will lead the country be in the Erasmus program, you are generating a cosmopolitan political class by default. And so actually telling someone, oh, you should be more cosmopolitan to be a politician in Spain or in France or Germany. That cosmopolitanism layer in politics is extremely important for stability long term in the actual European project. And that's why the Erasmus program is so important.
And I think to once again go back to a point I've made a few times already, the way the priorities have been set forward, the way the budget is spent, the places in which the energy has been placed are all absolutely wrong for the last decade. Absolutely wrong. And the Erasmus program is one example of the type of initiative that, or the Schengen Agreement, which is not per se a EU institution, it's a
Sure.
sister creation, but it's essentially the police and the judiciary structure that you need to
Right.
have the free flow of people across borders that is at the core of the EU. So it is a EU creation, even though it's not officially an EU entity. The Schengen Agreement, as we said, the Erasmus Agreement, the idea of increasing resources for Frontex. These policies yield huge results with very little investment. Less energy should be placed on over-regulating stuff that should not be regulated in the first place. And a lot more attention
but
should be
I don't
placed to
think
these
we are
high-yield
going to-
programs.
Obviously, I agree with all that.
Defense, for example, I was saying like we're not doing defense at the EU level. And there are 100 things we should be doing at the European level. Plus, then the European Union is making sure it commits to things that it shouldn't be committing itself to. Let's use all of that for the
I agree with everything you're saying.
areas that
But I feel like maybe a point where we disagree is the source of the European priorities that are, I think, not really Brussels sourced. Brussels is just dependent politically on member states. And the member states themselves have bad governments and bad governance. And therefore, it reflects in also the priorities that the Commission adopts. That's my
Fair point.
differentiation.
And just to sort of round everything in terms of the future of the EU, I think that this unfinished business that we have with little areas such as the air traffic control, why should it be split in sky traffic control regions that are different to the actual region where these flights are taking place, which is a single European airspace? If you advance that, you advance travel, you facilitate, you make it quicker, you make it cheaper, you have less emissions. I see nothing but advantages coming from that. Same thing with the capital union, the banking union. All of these elements need to be, again, at the center of the conversation. And Brussels needs to make sure it takes every ounce of margin that it has to maneuver to reposition itself as an agent of this sort of change. Because if it keeps being the voice that wants to lead the Green New Deal, well, then
this is
be my guest and be Joe Biden number 2.
This is our essential
Joe Biden
difference. This
Jr.
is our essential difference. I think Brussels has no independent thought. If the member states do not want the capital market union, do not want defense, do not want common air traffic, do not want any of these things, they won't happen. So until you have a president in Spain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in Portugal that want these
because
things
you have the push goes both ways too. Although you can argue that the stake ends at the national stake, you're really taking it to the limit. Most of the conversation begins at the commission. The push comes in and out, up and down, commission to member state, and the other way forward.
Massive priorities, massive new priorities cannot be initiated from the commission because they don't have the actual competence to do it, nor do they have the actual politics.
You do realize, however, that when there is this drip of constantly pushing in that place, and when the EU project has this legitimacy in that it's seen as the higher body, it does limit the national governments from...
The people at the top of the commission are put there by national governments.
Put it to you like this. Hungarians and Poles that have been challenged by EU continuously, sometimes over policies I don't agree with, but EU had it their way. At the end of the day, you had it their way. So the ability to fight the entire machinery is not really that possible. At the end of the day, they withdraw funds from you. They start procedures against you. Just essentially,
But the procedures that the Commission has done against Hungary, against Poland, are all directly flowing from the rules of the game, right? The Commission can enforce what they're doing. They're enforcing rules from the treaties.
some interpretations of the treaties there have been proper. Some have not.
And that's where it goes to court.
Yes, and by the way, we have not spoken of the court, but I have a good opinion of the court. I think that is a very valid guarantee that the system has, because I do think its interpretation of the treaties and its interpretation of the basic tenets in the EU legislation.
And I would say, remember, when the Commission, for not all, but when the Commission went after Poland for some of what they claimed to be violation of rule of law, they lost in the court.
By the way, the same European authorities that have allowed complete overreach of the rule of law in Spain,
Yes,
and have done nothing about it.
because Spain's a powerful country in the EU. This is the kind of
yes.
thing. The Commission does not have ultimate control.
That's a big argument against it, especially if you're a Spaniard.
Yes,
But anyway, moving forward, I think the one thing that Europe is missing the most is growth.
yes.
Growth, growth, growth. That should be the only obsession right now. Everything else is secondary. So everything the Commission can do to kickstart growth, good. Can von der Leyen lead?
I don't think
the conversation
I don't think
growth?
we agree here either. Because
I don't think she can.
She's not a liberal, right?
Yeah.
But the growth is not stemming from Brussels. The growth
No, it's not.
is stemming
No, it's not. But
from
everything
capital.
Brussels can do to facilitate growth. I was giving the air traffic control as one example.
Sure.
But start picking these smaller fights, because you actually win the big fight by winning all the smaller fights.
But again, I think, Diego, you're missing this point again. The Commission can only be pro-growth if the people put on the Commission are pro-growth.
Mm-hmm.
And given that the member states put the people on the Commission to be not pro-growth, they're not going to be pro-growth.
However, the Commission officials have acknowledged their failure when they presented this compass and then adopted these recommendations from Draghi and whatnot. So they have admitted responsibility there. They have admitted a problem. They have acknowledged that they need to play a much better, more constructive role in fostering growth boom in Europe. Not saying this comes from Brussels, but if Brussels can constrain growth, Brussels does constrain some growth.
From a socialist commission, no matter how much they admit their wrongdoing.
So therefore, although it could be nice if the world worked as you have suggested today, because it works under a socialist.
The world, yeah, but the world. I think the world works how I suggested it, because if the politics does not want the thing to happen,
the politics doesn't want to. So
the thing that
therefore, EU is not being an element for positive change, unfortunately.
No, I agree with this point. I agree. I fully agree with the point. But my contention isn't that the EU is currently good for growth. My contention is the way to get the EU good for growth is for national governments to be good for growth.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And at the end of the day, that's the European citizens' choice to vote for Pepe or vote for AFD or vote for Chega or whoever they want to vote for to have that thing kickstart.
Oh, and by the way, a closing note on that, because you just brought Chega, the alt-right party in Portugal. Their candidate made it to the second round of the presidential election. Of course, it's a parliamentary system, so what really matters is having the prime minister's office. He himself is running for this position now, but it's kind of a publicity stunt of sorts, because what he wants to is to be the prime minister, the head of government. But he made it inadvertently to the second round. No one expected this at first, and the polls started leaning more and more his way. And now the PP has decided to support the social democratic candidate for the presidential election, which just, again, opens up this dialogue about how much they try to keep this big coalition going, this power-sharing agreement. And this is not going to help their cause long-term.
Correct.
Because long-term, the Portuguese are probably going to be denied of having more, let's just say, right-wing policies, which is what the electorate is demanding. And because they're not going to be given this, just because their politicians have decided to keep this power-sharing agreement above the elections of the results, this will probably exacerbate the vote for the Eurosceptic party, that is Chega. So again, then we can blame them and position them as radicals.
I do blame them.
But
I blame everybody. Blame
yeah, but
the politicians.
but
yes.
they're but
Because they still should not be trying to push the idea of being anti-Europe. They're all to blame. I'm
no, no,
blaming all of them. I blame all
it
of
is a
them.
mess. Well, we can certainly converge on that.
Okay.
Um,
So, Diego, we're going to have to end the podcast here. We're definitely going to pick back up some of these European points later. We haven't discussed the court at all. I have strong views on that. I'm sure you have some too.
I think you do more because now you're our big shot lawyer. I'm just trying to do my best to do my economics, and that's more or less it. But a lot more conversations. And anyway, whenever we discuss European affairs, predominantly Hispanic, Europe is an actor, so we'll be speaking about this some more. We'll be speaking of Giorgia Meloni in the future.
That's right.
We name dropped this sometime in the previous episodes, this trip to Milano that we did. So we'll let you know how that went, but more specifically, we'll discuss Italy as a country that is undergoing some significant and interesting transformations right now. Keep following the podcast, keep listening to the podcast, keep sharing the podcast. We're happy to come to you every week.
Bye.